Thank you very much, Sister Chair. I didn't know that you were going to read out all of that. So, Sister Chair, President and General Secretary, other members of the Executive of the Antigua and Barbuda's Workers' Union, and yes, I will claim honorary membership in a while when I give some of my relationship with you. Delegates all, members of Parliament, in particular, the Leader of the Opposition, Brother Jamal Springer, Pringle, sorry, Jamal, yes, sorry, Pringle, my handwriting. That must be CPL. I was looking at CPL last night, so political leader of the UPP, Brother Harold Lovell, former Prime Minister Baldwin Spencer, other trade union leaders, invited guests, members of the media, those who are also looking at us on the Facebook live stream. A very good afternoon. I had morning, but it's now afternoon. A very good afternoon to you. I wish to very sincerely thank your General Secretary, Comrade David Messiah, for reaching out and extending the very kind invitation to me to deliver the feature address at this, your 56th Annual Delegates Conference of the Antigua and Barbuda Workers' Union. I consider it an honor. Of course, I feel very much at home here in Antigua because of the very long relationship of friendship and solidarity that I have had with your union as a result of my having served, yes, in various capacities during my 39 years with the Oilfields Workers Trade Union in Trinidad and Tobago. For those of you who are quite young, the Antigua Workers Union, as it then was, found an older sibling in the Oilfields Workers Trade Union to guide and support its development. Comrades Keithlin Smith, Malcolm Daniel, Baldwin Spencer, and others were regular visitors to Paramount Building, the headquarters of the Oilfields Workers Trade Union. And we will never forget the hospitality and solidarity offered by your first General Secretary, Brother George Walter, and others to Comrade George Weeks, our then President General, and his wife, when they were seeking to have a quiet vacation following P.G. Weeks's political detention during the state of emergency in 1970, and who were denied entry by immigration and governments in several other Caribbean islands. Whenever I speak, because of my long experience, not age, long experience, I like to share a little bit of history because it's important that we know some of these things. Baldwin has stayed at my yard in Trinidad. David and your president, Brother Chester, have all been to the Oilfields Workers Trade Union Paramount Building for various seminars. Harold, I ran into your sister Sandra a few days ago in Trinidad because she lives in Trinidad. So as we're talking about relationships, Sandra, last name is West. She married a West. I have married a West. Although I don't think, though they're both from San Fernando, I don't think they're actually related. I haven't sorted that one out yet. Harold's other sister was a student at UE St. Augustine when I was there. I was a little ahead of her. But she was very wise and didn't take on any Trini old talk. Otherwise, we might have been brothers-in-law. I'm sure Debbie will kill me for having said that. Our respective unions, movements, and comrades in struggle. Sister Chair, and when I did my address, I didn't know who was chairing, so I wrote brother. I'm very happy that we have a young sister chairing today. Excellent. I was recalling my own interactions with your union when I was given the distinct privilege to deliver the feature address at your 30th anniversary gala dinner. So that's 26 years ago, when you were about... as well as a previous annual delegates conference held right here in this hall. So the Antigua and Barbuda Workers Union is a second home. And I also wish to record my deep appreciation for the excellent hospitality extended to me on this my working visit to Antigua by your executive committee. Chair, I read the General Secretary's report to your last annual Delegates Conference held in 2022, and I was very impressed by the extensive work of your union. The range and number of workplaces represented by the ABWU is indeed significant, as is the progressive and dynamic direction of the union, from its strategic retreat to the development of its social media presence and communications efforts, hiring someone as your PR who is experienced in media and journalism, to the youth arm and reestablishment of the Women's Initiative. Your social outreach during the COVID-19 pandemic was very commendable, and the identification of global and national issues, including climate change, the impact of technology on the workplace, and the need for a labor agenda, and the placing of political action as a priority, are all proof that the ABWU is one of the leading trade unions in the Caribbean. My congratulations to your executive committee and all the officers and shop stewards on your outstanding achievements. But, Sister Chair, as your theme for this, the 56th Annual Delegates Conference, correctly identifies, you cannot rest on your laurels. The struggle continues. This phrase, so appropriately chosen as your theme, is the English translation of the war cry of our sisters and brothers who, in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, were fighting for their freedom from colonialism and racism in the Portuguese colonies in Africa, Mozambique, Angola, and Guinea-Bissau. Their rallying cry was "A luta continua." The struggle continues. So I want you to say, "A luta continua." Right, because that's how we would have said it in many international conferences in solidarity around the world. Sister Chair, I wish, if you would allow me, to tackle your very important theme by briefly discussing the following factors that make it imperative that the struggle continues. And the other David and I seem to have been on the same page in some of these areas, though we didn't discuss it. One, neoliberal policies and their impact on workers. Two, the changing demographics of workers. Three, technology, AI. Four, climate change, but I want to add loss and damages and reparations. And five, the underpinnings of our crisis, or crises, decolonization, and the crisis of capitalism. For the young people who are now beginning, or who have not traveled very far in their journey of being a trade union activist, I want you to internalize this theme: the struggle continues. You need to take example from comrades like Brother Baldwin. He has done it all. Trade union executive member for many, many years. Leader of the opposition. Prime Minister. Yet he has not said, let me just enjoy my well-deserved retirement. You know, young people now will say, bucket list, done that. Trade union, done that. Leader of the opposition, done that. Prime Minister, done that. Bucket list, done. Harold, you missed by one on your bucket list, eh? But I ain't getting into Antigua Barbuda politics at all. Leave me out of that. Some of us will say, tick, done that, yes? But Brother Baldwin is back with the ABWU, assisting with the defense of workers. Why? Because the struggle will always continue once there is injustice and once workers are being exploited, treated unfairly, discriminated against, and oppressed. The struggle must continue once there is inequality of wealth and income within countries and between countries. Once a few companies and countries are destroying the environment. Once there is racism and the domination of the many by the few. Once you know the history of the movement and appreciate its philosophy or ideology, you will realize that the labor movement must not be treated, young people, like a fad that you will do for a while, or something that will look good on your resume, or something that you could ride its back for your personal gain. We had that, I know that from OWU. People become shop steward, branch officer, next thing you know, bam, they're representing the employer. Remember, I around a long time, I in the trade union movement, I was there for 39 years. I know all the stories. It is a movement. Our movement is a movement that must continue to struggle for a better world, a better day, and a better life for all. And this is why you must be dedicated and committed. Dedicated and committed to properly represent your fellow worker. Dedicated and committed to your trade union. Dedicated to the proud tradition of struggle, and committed to the noble cause of improving the lives of workers and to the cause of humanity. And to all the naysayers out there who some years ago and even today are claiming that trade unions are dead. You know, they said trade unions are dinosaurs, belong to a former era, that we must not engage in struggle. We must just have some good talkers and so on, and have good research papers, and they could negotiate everything with the employers. Take a look, sisters and brothers, at what is happening all around the world. There is the most powerful wave of strikes taking place in the wealthiest countries right now. Just 2 days ago, the United Auto Workers Union in the United States began a historic strike against all three big auto companies, GM, Ford, and what used to be called Chrysler, the big three. This has never happened before in the history of the UAW. Recently, flight attendants at American Airlines voted to go on strike. Writers and actors went on strike in Hollywood. In the UK, many different groups of workers, including so-called essential workers, have been taking strike action. Doctors, senior and junior, nurses, emergency medical technicians, what we would call ambulance workers, railway and bus workers, among many others. In Europe, the story is the same. Oil workers, workers at airports, transport workers, you name it. And they have been on strike in Germany and France especially. So you see, the struggle continues. I now want to say, this is the reality, but it's not enough to rattle off these facts of life. We must ask the question, why? And I want to suggest it is because of the impact over many decades of what is called neoliberal policies being implemented by governments and big capital. We used to call these policies structural adjustment back in the 1980s. These policies got a big push in the Margaret Thatcher, Ronald Reagan days, and were the standard diet that the Washington Consensus, I heard the pastor talk about what he got, like a purge. Right. Standard diet that the Washington Consensus, Washington, D.C., where they're all headquartered, International Monetary Fund, the IMF, World Bank, the Inter-American Development Bank, and the U.S. State Department, pushed down our throats without anything to sweeten it afterwards when we ran into debt problems. It was an unhealthy purge that they forced us to take. Privatization, reducing the size of the public sector, cutting wages and benefits of workers, getting rid of collective agreements, free trade were just some of the bitter medicine that was forced down our throats. The objective was to remove all the constraints on capital. Capital must be free to move across borders, free to access any market, free to get its hands on and exploit our natural resources, free to squeeze labor so as to extract the maximum profit by reducing labor costs. Deregulate and liberalize was the strategy. Now, this was capital's backlash and response to what happened after the Second World War, when there was a social settlement of social democracy. And I saw that in your last year report, Brother David. What were the components of that post-war settlement of social democracy? Strong trade unions, decent pay and job security for workers, high taxes on the rich, and governments using this tax revenue to provide, at subsidized prices, health care, education, housing, public transport, water, electricity, proper social security plans for the elderly, among other things. This was the welfare state, not giving welfare to people. That's how they like to bad talk it. It's not giving out handouts to people, but the state having the principal responsibility for ensuring the welfare and well-being of everyone. This helped to guarantee social stability. There was social mobility. Ordinary workers could see their children getting better educated than them, getting better jobs, going to university, and therefore there was a commitment, because of job security, to company, community, and country. But big capital rebelled against this. They wanted to make bigger profits, greed. And so neoliberalism became the new gospel. And look what has been the result. There's a greater concentration of wealth and power today than ever before. Put it another way, the rich have become richer and the poor poorer. This inequality is now one of the biggest threats to social stability. According to the Oxfam 2023 report on inequality, the richest 1% in the world got 2/3 of all the new wealth created in the 2 years of COVID, which is about twice the amount of money that the poorest 99% of the world's people got in that same period. A recent Bank of England, so I'm quoting now crazies like me, right? I'm quoting Bank of England research report found that 45% of the companies in their survey plan to increase their profit margin in the coming 12 months, while 32% say they will keep it the same. In other words, no haircut on profits for them. No tightening of belts for those companies. The study found that the top 10% of profitable firms actually had profit margins of close to 30%, compared to less than 20% in 2005. One trade union leader in England, Sharon Graham of Unite, calls this greedflation. In other words, inflation, which David spoke about, is not only being driven by the war and higher oil prices and so on. It is certainly not being driven by wage increases. It is being driven by higher and higher profits. Yet the neoliberal policies being implemented by governments and central banks to tackle inflation are to increase interest rates, to make the cost of borrowing and loans higher, and also, therefore, for companies to reduce labor costs by encouraging retrenchment of workers, because as there are more people who are unemployed without a job, then there's greater competition for jobs, and so workers might be prepared to accept a lower pay. That is how they want to deal with inflation, not dealing with the profits, but attacking the little that workers are getting. In the United States, 61% of workers live from payday to payday. I know about Antigua. I could tell you in Trinidad and Tobago, the vast majority of workers can't make it from payday to payday. In the US, the pay of chief executive officers increased by 1,360% from 1978 to now. Billionaire wealth increased to 4.2 trillion US dollars in the US during COVID. These are just some examples, and you could do all the research, you could Google it and so on. What I can say that in Trinidad and Tobago, the profits of all the big companies, Massey, Ansa McCall, Agostini, Prestige Holdings, Guardian Group, the banks like Scotia, Republic, Royal, all their profits have been going up and up. On the other hand, most workers in the country have had no increase or minimal increase in their pay in the last 9 to 10 years. So the cost of living has gone up in the last 9 or 10 years in Trinidad and Tobago, but their pay has not gone up. So the dollar that a worker was working for 10 years ago is probably only worth 60 cents today. Chair, neoliberal policies have resulted in growing inequality, but this is not all. Trade unions have been under relentless attack. I know about Antigua, I know about Trinidad. In many countries, trade union membership as a percentage of the total labor force has been shrinking. This is partly due to deindustrialization and a shift in employment from factories and heavy industry to the services sector, hospitality, food and beverage, security, stores, retail. I see that you in the ABWU have been able to unionize many groups of workers in the service sector, and I congratulate you for that. That is not the case in Trinidad and Tobago, where our labor law, the Industrial Relations Act, makes it extremely difficult for unions to get recognition for service sector workers, and I wouldn't bore you with the details, just take it from me, that, and I was General Secretary, we may have applied for recognition to a company and didn't get recognition for 5 and 7 and 9 years. Yes? Some cases, 15 years you apply for recognition and can't get it, because we have a wicked, oppressive piece of legislation called the Industrial Relations Act. This is also the case for unions in the US, for example, where it's been a big struggle to unionize workers at places like Amazon and Starbucks, and you may see some of that in the media. The lower level of unionization is also due to a deliberate policy by employers and some governments of union busting and keeping the union out of the workplace, like when the government of Trinidad and Tobago closed down Petrotrin. All 5,000 workers were sent home, and the Oilfields Workers Trade Union lost 5,000 members by a stroke of a pen. And that decision was taken without a single study recommending the closure of that company, not a single study. 3 PowerPoint slides were used to justify that. But they wanted to get rid of the union and get rid of the collective agreement. So instead of permanent workers in the oil fields, you now have workers working on labor supply contracts arrangements, almost a step above slavery. Where there is no trade union, there is no collective agreement. And so the employer can do whatever he or she wants, pay whatever, discriminate, victimize, and so on. Collective agreements regulate the workplace for the better. And in fact, the best and most efficient firms actually have a regulated workplace and have collective agreements. But big capital wanted total freedom to maximize profits, and collective agreements and trade unions prevented that, so get rid of them. Then there is a strategy of using short-term contract employment. Imagine in Trinidad and Tobago today, most of our doctors in the public sector are working on 2 and 3 months contracts. Yes. Some have no contracts at all. This use of contract labor has created what is now called a precariat, because employment is now precarious, no security. There's no job security, no proper benefits. This reduces workers to living a life with no hope of a decent future. You can't borrow money to buy a motor car, far less a house if you have no job security. Some young workers will migrate if they can, like our doctors. And this means a brain drain for our small nations with limited human resources. Other youths just don't even bother to look for work, and I heard your labor commissioner talking about this. Some prefer to try and get money easy by joining gangs. Get rich or die trying is their mantra. But this is because of how capital is restructuring the labor market. Sister Chair, all of these impacts on workers resulting from neoliberal policies, and I haven't addressed them all, mean that the struggle must continue. There are a whole host of industrial relations issues at the workplace that have as their root neoliberal policies. And neoliberal economic policies negatively impact workers' lives in so many ways. The very quality of life, how you live, whether you have enough money to put food on the table when the morning comes, if you have passage to send the children to school, or put something good in their lunch kits, or buy the school books and uniforms, and have something saved to pay for the doctor and medicine in an emergency, or be able to buy a drink and take a lime with the family on a weekend. I even talking about going on a holiday abroad. I just thinking about take a little lime on the weekend. All of this, our very lives are being affected by neoliberalism. And trade unions, which have as a core responsibility to improve the lives of its members in particular and workers in general, therefore have to continue the struggle against neoliberal policies, not just at the workplace, but at the national level against these policies, and therefore for a better day and a better life. But, Chair, to achieve this, we need dedicated and committed unionists. Let me now shift to the issue of the changing demographics of workers. One of the features of the 21st century workplace is how it has changed from 40 or 50 years ago. Today, we have many more women workers. In fact, many workplaces have far more women than men. Today, we have young workers, millennials, who are over 27 but under 40. And now, sorry, I was looking at the president. So don't take basket. And now Gen Z workers who are between 18 and 26 years old. None of these workers have a clue, Baldwin, about the Grenadian Revolution, March 13, 1979. I remember that like yesterday. Or the 40th anniversary of the assassination of our friend and comrade Maurice Bishop and his comrades, which we will mark the 40th anniversary on October 19th, a few weeks from now. Don't know about that. How many of these workers know about the struggles in the 60s and how the ABWU, as it then was formed? The bullet holes in the office downstairs. Whenever I come, I was asked to see the bullet holes. Social media is how they get the information. Much of it false or misleading, or presented by persons whose agenda is opposed to labor. Sister Chair, neoliberalism has also brought about everywhere the phenomenon of migrant labor on an unprecedented scale. Right here in the Caribbean, we have migrant labor. In Trinidad and Tobago, we have thousands, tens of thousands of Venezuelans, most of whom enter the country illegally but who are working. At the lovely hotel where I'm staying, I've met quite a few people from the land of my birth, which was Jamaica. I was born in Jamaica, but I've been living in Trinidad and Tobago since '71, so I'm more Trinidad than Jamaica. With the recent decisions of the CARICOM heads of government, the issue of the full implementation of the free movement of labor under the Caribbean single market economy will take place in a matter of months. So there's an issue of migrant labor. When trade unions were legalized in Britain in 1824, they were called combinations. Of course, we here in the West Indies couldn't form trade unions in 1824. We were still slaves. And right after the ending of slavery, the British colonial power banned combinations here in the West Indies. But back to Britain. Combinations properly describe the nature of the organization, the combination of workers into a single whole in order to struggle against the employer and for better terms and conditions of work for members. Combination implies unity. It also suggests solidarity. A blow to one is a blow to all. And I want to therefore say that this is something that we have to go back to, understanding our root. Blow to one is a blow to all. Solidarity, combination, unity. Sister Chair, how do we address the changed demographics of the workplace? By internalizing those watchwords of solidarity and unity. We must have unity at the workplace if we are to have success in the continuing struggles ahead. And for there to be unity, we must recognize how the workplace has changed. Women must be included at all levels of the union. Women can and must represent. And you could get no better than having dedicated and committed women who are leaders of the trade union movement. Well, the women not clapping for that one. All right. Interesting. This requires policies that are gender-based. It demands that collective agreements reflect the interests and concerns of women workers. One example of this, and maybe you've taken it up already, is the need for daycare and breastfeeding facilities at the workplace. This issue will challenge patriarchy and the traditional male-dominated culture of trade unions. Young workers have to become active members of the union. This requires new communication methods and strategies. Young people today don't like to listen to long speeches like the one I am now giving. They want a 5-minute soundbite or 30-second soundbite on Instagram and TikTok. But how do we develop their understanding of the rich history and tradition of struggle and develop their consciousness so that these young people can become dedicated and committed members and leaders if all they're getting is 30 seconds at a time? This is a challenge. And Chair, it is a bigger challenge since our education system has been deliberately set up to make sure that our young people don't know the history of our people, which is really the history of labor. How do we ensure that migrant workers are treated fairly and not discriminated against and exploited? Do our countries have policies on migrant labor? What labor laws need to be changed? Can migrant workers join trade unions? In Trinidad, we have a real problem. The Vennies who register with the government, because some of them were allowed to register, some did, some didn't, they can work legally, but they pay no tax, no NIS, no health surcharge. Their children, on the other hand, are not entitled to an education, and technically they are not supposed to access health care in the public system. Many of these migrant workers, especially those who are not registered, are super exploited. There's human trafficking, prostitution, and a few may be involved in gun running and gangs. We have to address all of these things. Technology and AI, and the General Secretary, Senator Messiah, has dealt with this. But this is just one issue that is only emerging. Of course, there has been an ongoing revolution in technology for the past 40 years. The microchip, computerization, robotics have all impacted the workplace. I mean, 40 years ago, this didn't exist, right? When I went to boarding school in Jamaica, I got a letter once a week from my parents. I wrote a letter once a week. That was the only communication I had with my parents. Today, parents now, every minute, you okay? Yes, mommy, yes, daddy. Are you all right? You're tracking. Once a week, a letter. All of these things have impacted the workplace. Jobs have become redundant. Job content has changed. For example, it would have been impossible to think about working from home during COVID 20 years ago. The internet and tech developments such as Zoom and Google Meets made that possible. But AI, and I want to now include 3D printing, are taking things to a whole new level. 2 weeks ago in Trinidad and Tobago, the police service discovered a 3D printing facility that was making high-powered AR-15 rifles. 3D printer. That is where that could go, in the wrong hands. AI is being used to diagnose illnesses and write legal briefs. Some students are using it to write essays and theses, which in my view is cheating, quite apart from being lazy. If we rely on AI to do all the thinking for us, what will become of our ability to think critically and analyze situations? How do we as trade unions confront all of this? Certainly, I don't want to see AI represent workers in industrial disputes where the human element has disappeared. After all, industrial relations, well, I was in the movement many years ago, is also about human relations. You come to work late many times, so you could get a warning letter, suspension, dismissal, not so? Federation of Employers could say that, right? But behind that, an AI will simply look at the data and say, you come too late 4 times, warning letter. 10 times, suspension. 20 times, dismissal, not so? But in fact, what might be happening is, which AI doesn't know, is that there's a crisis at home. An ill parent or spouse or a child who is autistic that needs to be taken care of. Human relations can't be tracked yet by AI. An important first step for us is to ensure that whatever government policies and legislation dealing with AI has the active input of the labor movement. And this has to be done not only at the national level, but at the regional and international levels as well, since AI is a global development. And AI and technology will be used by multinational companies with impacts not only in their own country, but globally. So we must, as the slogan demands, think globally and act locally. Let me move now to climate change. Sister Chair, when I left Trinidad and Tobago 2 days ago, it was hot like hell. After I left, the Met Service issued a bulletin, the first of its kind that I could remember. Usually they warn us of bad weather, yellow, orange level, rainfall, and flash flooding, because you know when rainfall, and where I live is low-lying. So when the rainfall heavily, we just Mako, they look at the little river just down the road to see if the water coming up in the yard. But this time, the Met Office issued a heat wave alert, saying that high temperatures will continue for the next 2 weeks. And I say this to highlight the issue of climate change. I know that you are very well aware, even more than us in Trinidad, of the fact that our Caribbean islands are all extremely vulnerable to climate change. Massive and powerful hurricanes, sea level rise, coral reef bleaching, and so on. All of this impacts negatively on our economies, based as they are on tourism. Then there is the discussion on a just transition from fossil fuels to renewables. This has particular implications for countries such as Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, and Suriname, because we produce oil and gas and get most of our revenue from oil and gas. But I'm not dealing with that. What I do want you to consider, however, is the demand by countries of the global south for loss and damages arising from climate change. Sister Chair, we in the global south are not the principal contributors to climate change. The countries of the north are the ones who, through their economies, which are based on massive consumption, use a vast amount of energy. That energy is primarily obtained through the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. Their consumption has also meant that they have exploited our natural resources and destroyed our forests and natural environments. And while the countries of the north are now experiencing the negative impacts of climate change, like floods and droughts and heat waves, because of their size and the nature of their economies, only part of their populations feel these impacts at any one time. This is not your experience. In an hour, one hurricane, how long did it take to destroy Barbuda? About an hour? A few hours. One hurricane can destroy the national economy for years to come, put a significant number of people out of work, cause huge infrastructure damage, reduce government revenue, and devastate our foreign exchange earnings. As trade unions representing workers who form the majority of the population and who are very significantly affected by the impacts of climate change, we need to be in the forefront of the global struggle for loss and damages arising from climate change. Some of our governments have been leading this charge in international forums, and I want to single out the Prime Minister of Barbados, Mia Mottley, for leading the charge in this regard. But we can't leave it purely up to them. We too, as trade unionists, have to take up this issue. Similarly, we need to champion the case for reparations. Loss and damage from climate change and reparations are linked. They are linked because of how industrialization and capitalism developed. Slavery and the slave trade financed the industrialization of Europe and thus enabled capitalism to become the dominant system of economic development. We are owed reparations because of slavery and the slave trade. Don't be embarrassed to say it, you know. We are owed. In fact, the British slave owners were compensated for the loss of their slaves. And the government of England was paying them up until about 5 or 6 years ago. They were getting compensated for the loss of their slaves, and the people who are victims of slavery, people in this room, have not gotten a cent. We have a right to demand reparations. And we are owed loss and damage arising from the way that industrial capital used fossil fuels to create the modern consumer economy. Loss and damage due to climate change, reparations, and the restructuring of the financial system from the old Bretton Woods arrangements of the 40s, as the IMF and World Bank and so on, to a system that is based on today's realities, is an area of struggle that must engage the trade union movement. This goes to the heart of challenging the neoliberal model of development. How successful the countries of the global south are on these issues will have an impact on the quality of life of our members and the working class. And again, we need to act in concert with others, regionally and internationally, on these issues. Our counterparts in the global north need to be educated about why reparations, because the unions up north ain't really on that, you know. The truth be told, they benefited from the wealth that we gave them through slavery and industrialization, but they were never told that story. So we need to tell them that story. And why loss and damage for climate change? Our regional affiliates need to act as one on these crucial matters, for we all face what some have described as an existential threat to our very existence, something that could just wipe us off the face of the earth. As David Rudolph once sang, we live in a world which doesn't need islands no more. Sister Chair, my final point. I told Brother Chester I'd finish at 1, which apparently is your lunchtime, right? But I think I might go to 2. I'm just seeing if you're alert still. My final point, Sister Chair, for I've already tested the patience of delegates, is that we have to put all of this in a context. What is driving all of this? What is it that we must do to find the solutions that would unlock the problems that I've described? You see, when I reach my age, Baldwin's age and so on, Harold is a little younger, you have to kind of look at a strategic thing. What is the one thing that could maybe bring about some real change? Yes, you could do little incremental things. So we negotiate and we get a 5%, a 10%. And then something happened, inflation, push that back, and your 5% become -5, right? You get a collective agreement at one workplace and then the employer shut down and relocate to some other country and so on. So after all these years in the trade union movement, you know, you go through this year after year after year, you say, well, what can we do to maybe really push for fundamental change? And I believe that where the world is now, we're at a critical moment in world history where we could either go very bad, as the General Secretary said, with war and so on, or maybe we could have a gigantic leap forward in the interests of the majority of the people. But that depends on dedicated and committed trade unionists. I wish to suggest that as a movement, we need to seriously discuss 2 related aspects of what underpins our condition today. The first is that we have to put decolonization back on the agenda. But you may say we are independent nations. We have been for decades in Trinidad and Tobago and Jamaica for more than 6 decades, 62. So why talk about decolonization? I believe is a necessary discussion because the formal ending of colonialism when we became independent nations did not result in an end to the colonial structures and the colonial power systems. Conversation I'd like to have with 2 of those gentlemen there because they were in government. And I'm sure they came up with the structures of power. The very institutions of our state, our parliaments, how the cabinet is constructed, judicial system, and so much more, not fundamentally different from those under colonialism. We have changed faces, but the system of power hasn't changed. We don't have popular assemblies through which ordinary people can be formally involved in decision-making. The economic system remains essentially the same old plantation system. In Trinidad and Tobago, we exchange sugar for oil and gas, but the wealth still goes abroad to the owners of big capital, and we are still dependent on what they decide. We still produce what we don't consume, and we consume what we don't produce. And that is why we have food insecurity, which we started to find out about if we didn't know that before, during COVID. Most importantly, our education system is still very largely colonial. Do our children learn about the labor movement and the struggles of the 30s and 40s? Do they have a deep appreciation of our heroes and heroines? Do our local media houses have 50% local content? Or is it mostly out of the US? How do we develop dedicated and committed trade unionists when this is the situation? And we wonder why West Indies cricket is in such a crisis. Sir Viv and Sir Andy knew who they were. When Viv had a wristband which was ice green and gold. When Tony Gregg said in 1976 that they're going to make us grovel. And Viv beat the hell out of them, and Andy and Mikey Holding bounced the head off. They knew that they were fighting the colonial power. Our cricketers now, franchise cricket, they go play forever once they get paid. And they knew where Andy and Viv and the others knew where they came from and why the cricket field was an arena of struggle against colonialism. Today's generation are lost in that regard. Decolonization requires, first and foremost, what I call a revolution of the mind. As Bob Marley sang, we must emancipate ourselves from mental slavery. So decolonization is a process that is far from complete. In fact, some would argue that it is even more crucial today than it was in the 60s and 70s, since the earlier generation, for all their faults and weaknesses, they knew what they had to do to start the process of decolonization. As for the attacks on labor, the inequalities that exist, precarious work, climate change, all of these are symptoms of the crisis of global capitalism. We need to call it out for what it is. The concentration of ownership and wealth and income are all due to capital trying to maintain control by any means necessary, even at the expense of the environment and of humanity itself. We need to also analyze and assess the major global struggle, and Brother General Secretary mentioned it, the major global struggle between the old power, the US, which is being supported by the countries of Europe and a few in Asia like Japan and South Korea, and the countries that are building alliances around China. BRICS plus, G77 and China. This is all due to the crisis of global capitalism. And in fact, we need to look at the war in Ukraine in that context as well. This global battle is not, and Prime Minister Ralph Gonsalves correctly pointed this out yesterday at the G77 and China summit taking place in Havana, Cuba. He said it is not a battle, because that's what Biden says, you know. Biden and the others say, and the Europeans say, it's a battle between democracy and autocracy. False, wrong. Not a battle between democracy and autocracy. It is a battle between those who traditionally control the world's wealth and resources and who impose neoliberalism on us so as to further enrich themselves on the one hand, and on the other hand, the countries of the global south who are pressing for economic decolonization. Will this end badly, this big global struggle for humanity, such as by way of another world war? Labor everywhere must intervene for peace. Sister Chair, how do we confront all of this? By a labor agenda. This agenda, like that of our forefathers in the 1930s, must be based on a vision for our society, for what Prime Minister Gonsalves has called our Caribbean civilization. Let us never forget what the good book in Proverbs 29, my only biblical, I'm not a preacher, my father, who is still alive, is 96. He is the priest and bishop and preacher, for those who know him, former Anglican Bishop of Trinidad and Tobago for many years. He's the preacher, I'm not. But the good book in Proverbs 29 taught us, where there is no vision, the people, thank you very much, you know it. Do we want a society where there is no security for the future of our young people, thus leaving the door open to them to engage in violence and gangs? Or do we want a society where there is peace and prosperity for all, where everyone can develop to his or her full human potential, where we are in control of our own destiny, where there is social justice, and where everyone can participate in the institutions of national life? What kind of society? In the 1930s, the labor leaders had a vision, and they worked towards it. Let me remind you of what was written about how the modern West Indies was formed by labor. Modern West Indies was formed by workers, by labor movement. Dr. Susan Craig, Tobagonian, wrote about June 19, 1937, the strike in Trinidad. Quote, "The workers struck a blow at property, thus striking toward the state and the whole structure of colonialism. I want to say today, we must strike a blow to advance the struggle for decolonization." And Sir Arthur Lewis, later Nobel Prize winner from St. Lucia, Sir Arthur Lewis wrote, quote, "It is mainly on the development of this united labor movement that future progress in the West Indies depends," end of quote. Sister Chair, delegates all, sisters and brothers, future progress in our Caribbean, like Arthur Lewis said in the 1930s, depends mainly on a united labor movement, together with other progressive sections of society, and with a dedicated and committed and conscious leadership that will continue the struggle begun so many years ago. Aluta continua. Aluta continue. Thank you very much.